The autumn wind swept through the narrow dirt road that led into the quiet old village, rattling the shutters of weathered houses and carrying with it the faint smell of wood smoke. Life here had always been simple, steady, and a little harsh. The kind of place where days were counted by the rising of the sun and the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer. Yet, beneath the peaceful rhythm of the town, hunger and desperation had begun to creep in like an unwelcome shadow. Times were changing. Survival was no longer something one could take for granted. At the edge of the village, near a stretch of dry fields where corn once grew tall, a young woman walked slowly with her children trailing behind her. There. Clothes were worn thin, patched so many times the fabric barely held together. The children's faces were pale, their eyes sunken with exhaustion. Each step they took seemed heavier than the last, as if the weight of their empty stomachs pressed down on them harder than the chill of the evening air. The mother's lips trembled, though not from the cold. She had gone 3 days without hearing her children laugh, without seeing them smile. Instead, she had only heard their soft cries in the night, whispers of hunger that she could not quiet. She clutched the youngest against her chest, rocking the child gently as she tried to keep her own fear hidden. To the others, she spoke in a soothing voice, promising that they would find food soon, though in truth she had no idea where that food would come from. The markets had nothing left to sell. Neighbors had little more than they themselves could spare, and the church kitchen had long since run dry. Pride had kept her from asking for help sooner, but pride no longer mattered. What mattered was the survival of the 3 little ones who looked to her with hopeful eyes, even as their bellies ached. Rumors had reached her about the rancher on the far side of town, a man who owned more cattle and land than anyone else in the county. Some said he was cold-hearted, hardened by years of labor and loss, while others swore he was generous when it suited him. Whatever the truth, the woman knew he had food more than enough to feed her children. She had resisted going to him for days, fearful of what it might cost her, fearful of the way people spoke his name with either respect or quiet disdain. Yet as the sun dipped lower behind the horizon, she realized she no longer had a choice. The road to the ranch was long and dusty, lined with fence posts that leaned against the prairie wind. The children lagged behind, their small legs struggling, but she encouraged them softly, telling them there would be warm bread waiting, perhaps even meat. The promise was fragile, yet it was enough to keep them moving forward as they neared the ranch house. The sound of lowing cattle drifted across the fields. The animals grazed lazily, healthy and strong, striking contrast to her own children's frail bodies. The ranch house stood tall against the fading light, its wooden frame sturdy, its porch lantern already lit. A figure moved near the barn. Broad-shouldered and steady, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes. The woman's breath caught in her throat. She had never spoken to him before. Though she had seen him in passing at the general store, at the town meetings where his voice carried above the rest, he had a presence that filled the air, commanding but not unkind, though few dared to get close enough to know the man behind it. Her children clung to her skirts as they reached the gate. She paused, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might drown out the sound of the crickets in the grass. This was the moment she had dreaded, the moment she could no longer turn back. She pushed the gate open and stepped onto the rancher's land, her voice trembling as she called out. He turned, his gaze sharp, even in the dim light. For a long moment, he said nothing, only watching as the woman and her children stood before him. She lowered her head, gathering what little strength she had left, and spoke the words she had been carrying like stones in her chest. "My children haven't eaten in 3 days," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of her confession. "I'll be yours forever if you feed them." The silence that followed was heavy, stretching like a rope pulled too tight. The children huddled close, their eyes darting between their mother and the man before them. The rancher's expression was unreadable, his jaw tight, his hands still at his sides. He studied them with an intensity that made the woman's knees weak, yet she refused to look away. This was her last chance, her final hope. The air between them thickened, carrying the scent of hay and smoke, the soft rustle of cattle in the distance. The rancher stepped closer, his boots crunching against the dirt. The woman's heart raced, torn between fear and fragile hope. She didn't know if he would turn her away, mock her desperation, or extend the kindness she prayed he still possessed. Her children clung tighter, and she braced herself for whatever would come next. And then, as the lantern light flickered across his face, he finally opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. The rancher's lips parted as if to form words, but he stopped himself. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, not in anger but in the kind of deep thought that made the woman's stomach twist. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something in him, maybe pity, maybe weariness, but it vanished just as quickly. He looked past her at the children clinging to her skirts, their thin arms wrapped around her legs, their cheeks hollow from hunger. She swallowed hard, the silence clawing at her nerves. The rancher's presence was overwhelming. And the longer he stood there without speaking, the more she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The stories she had heard about him returned to her mind, stories of how he never let anyone take advantage of his generosity, how he'd turned men away when they came begging for feed during the last drought. Others whispered he had a past filled with loss, and that his heart had been sealed off ever since. She had no way of knowing which version of him she was facing now. Her children whimpered softly, and that sound pushed her forward. She took a hesitant step closer, clutching the youngest to her chest. "Please," she whispered again, her voice fraying. "They can't go another night like this. I'll—" The rancher finally shifted his weight, glancing toward the house. The warm glow of the lanterns flickered across the porch, casting long shadows that stretched out toward them. He let out a breath, slow and heavy, and motioned with his hand for them to follow. Relief washed over her for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by unease. She had no idea what price might come with his invitation. The children stumbled forward, their small feet dragging in the dirt. But their eyes lit up at the thought of stepping closer to the house. Food, warmth, safety, even if just for a night inside. The air smelled of leather, smoke, and something faintly sweet, maybe bread, left over from supper. The children's eyes darted to the table, where the remains of a meal still sat. A pot pushed aside, half a loaf of bread, and a plate where a thick slice of meat had been cut. To them, it was a feast. They stared without blinking their mouths, parting just slightly, but they didn't move until their mother gave them a gentle nod. They rushed forward, grabbing at the bread and tearing it into pieces. Their little hands moved so fast it almost frightened her, and she quickly tried to slow them, whispering for them to be careful. But the rancher said nothing. He only stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes never left her, though his face revealed nothing of what he was thinking. She didn't touch the food herself. Instead, she watched her children eat, her throat tightening with emotion. For 3 long days, she had listened to their stomachs growl, heard their weak cries in the night. To see them now, to see the life coming back into their eyes as they chewed, hungrily, was almost too much for her heart to bear. The rancher finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Why come to me?" She stiffened, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. "Because you have enough," she answered softly.
"Ow."
"Because no one else does." His eyes darkened at her words, though she couldn't tell if it was with offense or something else entirely. He straightened, stepping into the room fully now, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "And what makes you think I'd give it away?" Her lips trembled, but she held his gaze. "Because I have nothing left to offer but myself. If that's what it takes to keep them alive, then I'll give it." The silence that followed pressed against the walls of the room. Even the children, though too young to understand fully, seemed to sense the weight of it. The rancher's jaw tightened as he studied her, but his thoughts remained hidden behind the steel of his expression. The woman's mind drifted back to the village, to the way the people there used to smile at her when times were easier. Had shared pies after Sunday service, traded goods at the market, and leaned on one another when storms swept through the valley. But as the months grew harder, the smiles faded. Hunger had a way of turning friends into strangers, of pulling neighbors apart. She had asked once quietly if anyone could spare something for the children. But the silence that followed had told her everything. They were all holding on to scraps, and scraps could not be shared. She thought of the old mill, its wheels stilled. Now, by the low waters of the creek, and of the fields that lay barren where wheat once swayed, The village was fading, and she feared her children would fade with it. That fear had carried her here, to this house, to this man whose past was whispered about in hushed tones but never spoken of aloud. The rancher moved closer, pulling out a chair at the table. He sat slowly, the wood groaning beneath his weight. He didn't touch the food, didn't raise a hand to stop the children as they ate. His eyes stayed fixed on her. "You don't even know me," he said after a long pause. "I don't need to," she replied, her voice low. "I only need to know if you'll help them." His eyes flicked toward the children who were now nibbling at the last crumbs of bread. For just a second his face softened, and she caught at the trace of something human beneath the guarded exterior. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said quietly. "I understand enough," she whispered. The fire in the hearth crackled, filling the silence that stretched between them. The woman's heart beat so loudly she feared it might give her away the fear, the hope, the desperation that had driven her to speak words. She never imagined saying. The rancher leaned back, his chair tipping slightly as he crossed one leg over the other. He studied her with a calm that unsettled her, as though he were weighing her soul on an invisible scale. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. He only watched her, and in that watchfulness, she felt the tension coil tighter around her chest. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, and the sound of cattle lowing drifted through the night air. The house felt both like a refuge and a trap, a place where hope and danger sat side by side. Her children, full for the first time in days, leaned against one another, their eyelids heavy. She brushed their hair back gently, her hand trembling. As she did, she wanted to believe this was the beginning of something better, that perhaps the rancher's silence was not rejection, but thought. Still, doubt gnawed at her. The man who sat across from her was not just a rancher. He was a man who had built something in a world where most had lost everything. He was a man whose strength was both admired and feared. And now she had bound her fate to his, offering herself in a bargain she didn't yet understand. The room seemed to close in around her as she sat there, waiting, her children drifting into sleep. She tried to steady her breathing, tried not to let her fear show. She had given her plea, placed her life in his hands. Now all she could do was wait for him to decide what he would do with it. The rancher's gaze never wavered. His eyes shadowed. Beneath the brim of his hat, held secrets she could not read. He leaned forward slightly, the chair legs thudding back onto the floor, and the sound echoed through the room like a drumbeat. The woman's heart raced, her throat dry. She braced herself for his words, but once again he said nothing. The fire in the hearth had burned low, sending faint shadows across the walls. The woman sat in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. While her children slept in a corner, their small bodies curled together on a blanket the rancher had wordlessly laid on the floor. She should have felt relief, should have let herself breathe easier knowing their stomachs were no longer empty, but the quiet stretched too thin. Every moment of the rancher's silence felt like a test, weight pressing down on her until she thought her chest might cave in. At last, his voice came, low and measured. "Do you know what people say about me?" Her head lifted slightly. "I've heard things," she admitted carefully. "But words in a village are like leaves in the wind. They change direction too easily." He studied her for a long moment, as if gauging the honesty in her answer. "Some say I don't give unless I get something in return. Others say I built what I have by taking from those who were too weak to stop me. There's a bit of truth in both, maybe. But I've survived, and that's more than I can say for most who've lived around here." Above a whisper, "Survival isn't always enough, not when others are depending on you." Something flickered in his expression then, a shadow that passed behind his eyes. He looked away, toward the children sleeping by the fire. "You speak as though you've known loss." Her throat tightened. "I have. More than I care to name." The rancher didn't press, though she could feel his curiosity hanging in the room like smoke. She was grateful for his silence, for the fact that he didn't force her to dig up the memories she tried so hard to bury her husband's grave. The fever that had swept through the town, the crops that withered until there was nothing left to reap. Every hardship had carved her thinner, till she felt like nothing more than skin and bones held together by sheer will. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound carried across the open land. The woman shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. The rancher rose and threw another log on the fire, the flame springing up again. He didn't glance at her, but his presence filled the room all the same. She wanted to ask him what he expected of her now, what price he would demand. But the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she turned her eyes back to her children, focusing on their peaceful faces. For them, she would endure anything. That thought kept her steady even as uncertainty gnawed at her. The rancher finally spoke. Again, tomorrow, I'll put them to work. Not the little ones, but you. And maybe the oldest boy if he's strong enough. Her heart lurched, though she kept her face calm. What kind of work? Work that feeds mouths. Work that keeps this place standing. His tone was flat but not unkind. You wanted them fed. That means you'll earn their keep here. She nodded, though inside her chest her thoughts swirled. She had expected something like this, though she couldn't help but wonder what strings were hidden beneath his words. She had offered herself, and in doing so, she had bound herself to a bargain she didn't yet understand. That night stretched on, restless and heavy. When she finally closed her eyes, she dreamed of the village she had left behind. In her dream, she walked past houses with shuttered windows and empty porches. The faces of neighbors turned away as she begged for help. No one met her gaze. No one offered a word. She woke before dawn, her heart pounding, the taste of dust still in her mouth. The rancher was already awake, his boots echoing on the wooden floor as he moved through the house. He handed her a tin cup of coffee without speaking, and she murmured her thanks, wrapping her hands around the warmth. The children stirred, rubbing sleep from their eyes, and she coaxed them up with gentle words. They looked stronger already, though their bodies still trembled with weakness. As the morning sun rose, she followed the rancher outside. The land stretched wide and empty, the fields golden with dry grass, the fences lined with posts that seemed to run on forever. Cattle moved slowly across the pasture, their breath steaming in the crisp air. The ranch felt like another world compared to the dying village, a place where strength still lingered even in the face of hardship. He handed her a bucket and pointed toward the barn. Start with water. Animals don't wait, and they don't forgive neglect. She obeyed without question, carrying the heavy bucket with trembling arms. The work was hard, but it gave her something she hadn't felt in weeks. Purpose. She poured water into troughs, swept out the barn, and gathered eggs from the hens. Her muscles ached, her hands blistered, but the pain was something she welcomed. Pain meant she was doing something to keep her children alive. The rancher watched her from time to time, though he said little. She could feel his eyes on her, weighing her efforts, measuring whether she was worth the food he had given. She worked harder under his gaze, refusing to falter. She couldn't afford to falter. By midday, the sun burned hot, and she wiped sweat from her brow. The children lingered by the porch, their faces still pale, their bodies too frail for the labor of the ranch. The oldest boy, though, tried to mimic her movements, dragging small buckets of feed with determined steps. The rancher let him, though. He kept a close eye, as if testing both the child's will and his limits. As the days passed, the rhythm of the ranch became their new reality. The woman worked from dawn until dusk, her body growing leaner and tougher with each task. The children slowly regained their strength, their cheeks filling out, their laughter returning in small bursts. At night they slept soundly by the fire, their bellies no longer aching, but the tension never lifted. The woman felt it in every glance the rancher gave her, in every silence that stretched too long. He had not forgotten her words, her desperate promise. Neither had she. It hung between them, unspoken but unshakable, a tether that bound her to him. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, he finally broke the silence. "You've held up better than I expected," he said, his tone even. "Most would have quit by now." She met his eyes, her voice steady though her heart pounded. "I can't quit, not when their lives depend on it." He nodded slowly, though her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. That's what makes you dangerous. Her breath caught. Dangerous? What? The word rattled inside her. She didn't know whether he meant it as a warning or a compliment. She wanted to ask, but his eyes gave nothing away, and his lips pressed into a line that told her no further answers would come. In the nights that followed, whispers began to stir in the village. Word spread that the woman and her children had gone to the ranch. Some said she had traded her soul to him. Others claimed she had been taken in out of pity. The truth was known only to the 4 souls living within those walls. And the uncertainty of what others believed weighed heavily on her. She thought often of the village she had left behind, of the church bells that no longer rang, of the fields that lay barren. She wondered how long it would be before hunger drove others to the ranch, before desperation made more people risk their pride for survival. And if that happened, what would the rancher do? Would he take them in too? Or would he turn them away to protect what he had? Every day as she worked under the wide, endless sky, she felt the tension grow. Her promise had bought her children food and safety, but it had also placed her in the hands of a man whose thoughts were locked behind an unbreakable wall. She didn't know what he truly wanted from her, or when he might claim the words she had spoken that desperate night. The cattle moved like shadows across the land. The fences stood strong against the wind, and inside the ranch house, the air was heavy with unspoken things. She could feel it building, the weight of choices yet to be made, the shape of conflicts she could not yet name. And each night, as she lay beside her sleeping children, she asked herself the same question: had she saved them, or had she led them into something far more dangerous? The answer lingered in the silence, just out of reach, as the rancher's eyes followed her with a watchfulness that promised the story was far from over. The nights on the ranch grew colder as the season turned, and with the cold came a sharper edge to everything. The woman felt it in her bones each morning as she rose before the sun, her breath puffing white in the dim light of the lantern. She wrapped her shawl tightly, her fingers raw from days of hard work, but her spirit pressed forward with one steady thought: her children were alive. They were fed, safe, and warm. Yet beneath that fragile sense of relief, unease simmered like a fire smoldering under ash. The rancher had grown more watchful, though he rarely spoke. His silence was not the kind that gave comfort, but the kind that weighed down a room. When his eyes lingered on her, she felt the reminder of the words she had spoken that night, when desperation drove her to the porch of his house. "I'll be yours forever if you feed them." It was a promise she had not taken lightly, yet one she had spoken without understanding what forever might mean to a man like him. Her children thrived in ways she had not dared hope. The youngest no longer whimpered at night with an empty belly. The oldest stood straighter, his small shoulders beginning to carry responsibility as he helped with simple chores. The laughter of the middle child sometimes returned, bubbling up when he chased chickens across the yard. Those sounds healed parts of her heart she had thought broken beyond repair. But each moment of joy came with a shadow, for she knew it all rested on borrowed ground. One evening, after a long day of hauling feed and mending fences, she stepped into the barn to find the rancher saddling a horse. His movements were deliberate, practiced, his hands steady on the leather straps. She paused, watching him, and for the first time dared to ask, "Where do you go when the nights grow late?" Glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Business," he said simply. She pressed gently. "Business with who?" "There's little left in the village worth trading." The rancher's jaw tightened. For a long moment, she thought he would ignore her, but then he answered, his voice lower than usual. "Not everyone's hungry in the same way. Some want power, some want land. Deals are struck even when there's nothing but dust in the fields." Her stomach turned, though she didn't fully understand. Something in his tone carried warning, as though the ranch itself stood on more than cattle and fences it stood. On secrets? She didn't ask more, though the questions gnawed at her as he rode off into the night, leaving her alone with the children and the howling wind. The next day, whispers reached her from the village. A neighbor, worn thin from hunger, had wandered close to the ranch and begged at the fence. He had been turned away, though no one dared say whether the rancher himself had done it. The man stumbled back to the village empty-handed, his pride broken along with his strength. The woman listened quietly as one of the children repeated what they had overheard, and her heart sank. She knew it was only a matter of time before more came seeking help, just as she had. And she knew the rancher would not open his door so easily again. As days turned to weeks, the tension grew sharper. The woman noticed how the rancher's eyes followed her not only with suspicion but with calculation, as if weighing not just her strength but her loyalty. He began asking questions late at night, when the children slept and the fire burned low. "What did you leave behind in the village?" he asked once. "Not much," she admitted. "An empty house. Too weak to share. Memories that don't fill stomachs." "And yet you still think of it," he said. She didn't answer, but the truth was, she thought of it often. She thought of the church, its bell tower now silent, and of the graves on the hill where her husband and so many others lay. She thought of the people still there, struggling in silence. A part of her wanted to go back, to help them if she could. But another part knew she had chosen a path she could not undo. The rancher leaned forward then, his eyes sharp. "If you had to choose between them and this place, which would you choose?" Her breath caught, the weight of the question striking deep. "My children," she whispered. "Always my children." The rancher's gaze softened for the briefest moment, and then hardened again. "It's the only answer that keeps you standing here." In the following days, strange figures began to appear at the edge of the ranch. Men on horseback, their faces half hidden beneath hats, watching from a distance before disappearing into the hills. The woman noticed them while carrying water. One afternoon, their presence a dark shadow against the golden fields. When she told the rancher, his expression remained steady, though his hand tightened around the rope he held. "They're not here for you," he said. "They're here for me." Her fear grew, though he offered no explanation. That night, she lay awake listening to every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the shutters, wondering what enemies a man like him might have gathered. The children, innocent of such fears, played freely in the daylight. Yet even they began to sense the change. The oldest asked her once, "Mama, are we safe here?" She pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his forehead, and whispered the lie she needed to believe herself. "Yes, my love, as long as we stay together." But in truth, the walls of the ranch no longer felt like safety. They felt like a stronghold, preparing for a storm. One evening, as the sky turned crimson with the setting sun, the rancher gathered her near the barn. His voice was grave. "There are choices coming, choices you won't be able to escape. When the time comes, I'll need to know where you stand." Her chest tightened. "I told you already. I stand with my children. It's not enough," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You'll have to stand with me too, or against me. There won't be room for both." The words chilled her. She wanted to protest, to say she had already given enough, that she had already bound herself to him with her desperate promise. But she knew better than to argue. She simply nodded, though inside her heart beat like a trapped bird. That night, gunfire cracked in the distance, faint but unmistakable. The children stirred in their sleep, but she stayed awake, clutching them close, her ears straining for every sound. The rancher did not return until dawn, his face grim, his clothes dust-stained. He said nothing of where he had been, only told her to keep the children inside for the day. The suspense grew unbearable. Each day another step closer to something she could not yet see. The men on horseback returned more often, lingering longer at the edges of the land. The rancher grew quieter, his eyes darker, his jaw set like stone. The air itself seemed to hum with tension, as if the land was holding its breath. One afternoon, while hanging laundry in the crisp air, she heard voices beyond the fence. She froze, clutching the sheet in her hands as two men argued in low, harsh tones. She could not make out every word, but she caught enough threats, demands, warnings. Her blood ran cold. The rancher's enemies were closing in, and soon there would be no way to keep her children safe from the storm when she returned inside. Her hands shook as she tucked her children in for the evening. She whispered prayers under her breath. words she had not spoken since the day she buried her husband. She asked for strength, for protection, for a way through the darkness. The rancher entered later, his steps heavy, his eyes set with determination. He looked at her for a long time, longer than usual, and finally said, "When it comes, it'll come fast.
Oh.
Don't let fear blind you." She wanted to ask him what he meant, but the words caught in her throat. All she could do was nod, her mind spinning with dread. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the scent of dust and smoke across the land. The horizon darkened, though no storm clouds gathered. The woman felt it in her bones. The climax was near, the point where everything would break open. The rancher's enemies circled closer, her promise bound tighter, and the lives of her children hung in the balance. That night, as the fire burned low and silence filled the house, she lay awake staring into the shadows. Her children slept peacefully at her side, unaware of the storm about to descend. The rancher moved somewhere beyond the walls, his footsteps steady, preparing for what was to come. The woman closed her eyes, her heart pounding. She had come here out of desperation, but now she stood on the edge of something far greater, something darker. And as the first echo of distant hoofbeats reached her ears, she knew the moment of reckoning was closer than ever. The hoofbeats grew louder that night, steady and unrelenting, until they surrounded the ranch like a drumbeat of fate. The woman sat upright, her heart hammering in her chest as her children stirred beside her. The fire had burned low, casting the room in long shadows, and she could hear the faint clatter of horses shifting restlessly outside the fence line. It was as if the land itself had gone still. Waiting for what was about to unfold, the rancher stepped into the house, his hat pulled low, his face grim but steady. He looked at her with the same watchfulness he always had, though now there was something else in his eyes, resolve. He didn't speak at first, only checked the rifle leaning against the doorframe, then turned to her. "Keep them close," he said softly, nodding toward the children. "No matter what you hear, don't step outside." She wanted to protest, to beg him not to face the danger alone, but the words died in her throat. She knew better than to argue with a man who had lived his whole life by survival. Instead, she gathered the children close, wrapping them in blankets, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. Her oldest boy clung to her hand, his eyes wide with fear but also something more determination, a flicker of courage she had not expected in one so young. Through the cracks in the shutters, she saw them, riders in the night, faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, rifles glinting in the pale light of the moon. They circled the ranch like wolves, their presence heavy and threatening. The rancher stepped onto the porch, his figure outlined against the dim glow from inside. His voice carried out across the cold night, calm but firm. "You've come for what isn't yours," he called. "You won't find it here." A murmur rippled through the men outside, followed by a harsh laugh. One rider pushed forward, his voice sharp and filled with menace. "You've built this place on the backs of others. You've taken what you please, and now it's our turn." Woman's blood ran cold. She pressed her children closer, her ears straining to catch every word. The rancher stood tall, unmoving, as though the entire weight of the land rested on his shoulders. His voice never wavered. "I've built what I have with my own hands. If you want it, you'll have to take it." The air crackled with tension. For a moment, silence reigned, and then the sound of gunfire split the night. The woman gasped, pulling her children down to the floor as bullets struck wood and splinters rained around them. The children cried out, terrified, but she hushed them fiercely, her own heart nearly breaking with fear. The rancher returned fire, his shots steady, each one deliberate. The clash outside was chaos, shouts, horses whinnying, the sharp crack of rifles. She wanted to close her eyes, to shield her children from the sound, but she couldn't. She forced herself to listen, to stay ready for whatever might come. Minutes felt like hours, the fight stretching on in the dark. At last, the noise began to fade, the hoofbeats retreating into the distance. Silence crept back over the land, broken only by the wind and the labored breathing of the children huddled at her side. She dared to lift her head, her eyes searching the doorway, The rancher stood there, his shoulders heavy, his face drawn with exhaustion. His clothes were torn, his arms streaked with blood, but his eyes still burned with the same steady fire. He looked at her, then at the children, and gave a single nod. "It's done." She rushed to him, her hands trembling as she reached for his wounded arm. "You're hurt," she whispered, though he brushed it off. "Not enough to matter," he said. But she saw the pain in his face, the weight of what he had just endured. That night, after the children had finally fallen into uneasy sleep, she sat by the fire, cleaning the rancher's wound with what little cloth she had. He didn't speak much, but his silence was different, now less guarded, more human. For the first time, she saw not just the rancher, but the man beneath, a man who carried both strength and sorrow in equal measure. When dawn came, the land was quiet again. The riders had not returned, and the air felt lighter, though the woman knew danger might always linger at the edges of their lives. Still, something had shifted. The rancher had defended not just his land, but her and her children. And in that act, he had bound them together in a way words alone never could. The days that followed were marked by recovery. The ranch bore scars from the fight, fences splintered. The barn marked with bullet holes, but it still stood, strong against the wind. The woman worked harder than ever, tending to the land, keeping the children fed, making sure nothing went to waste. She felt her body grow stronger, her spirit steadier, even as uncertainty still hovered at the edges of her mind. The children, too, changed. Her oldest grew into his strength. No longer just a boy, but a helper at the ranch, his hands learning the weight of responsibility. The younger ones laughed more freely, their cheeks full again, their eyes bright. She watched them with quiet joy, her heart swelling with gratitude that they had been given another chance at life. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the rancher joined her by the fence line. He leaned against the post, his gaze on the horizon. "You've held your word," he said. She turned to him, her voice soft. "And so have you." They stood in silence for a while, the sounds of cattle drifting through the air, the children's laughter carrying faintly from the porch. The woman felt a calm settle over her, a peace she had not known in years. The ranch was no longer just his, it was theirs, not because she had claimed it, but because they had survived it together. The promise she had made on that desperate night had brought her to this place. But what kept her here was something deeper: trust, respect, a bond forged through hardship. As the stars began to appear overhead, the woman reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the village, of the hunger and loss that had driven her to seek help. She thought of the nights filled with fear, the whispers of enemies, the storm that had nearly broken them. And she thought of the rancher, the man who had seemed so distant and cold, but who had stood between her children and the world when it mattered most. Her children were alive, they were safe. And though the future was still uncertain, she knew they would face it together. The rancher glanced at her, his expression unreadable as always, but softer than before. "Forever," he said quietly, almost as if reminding her of the words she had spoken. She met his gaze, her heart steady. "Forever," she echoed, but this time the word carried no desperation, only truth. The land stretched wide around them, endless and untamed. Life here would never be easy, but it would be theirs to live. And as the night settled over the ranch, the woman felt, for the first time in years, that hope was stronger than fear. The story that had begun with hunger and despair ended now with something else: endurance, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family. In the quiet of the night, with the stars burning bright above, the woman knew she had found not just survival, but a life worth holding on to. And so the ranch stood, scarred but unbroken. A place where struggle had given way to strength, where promises had been kept, and where forever truly began.